The day my boss fired me, he did it in front of 12 people. He stood at the conference table, adjusted his tie, and said, "After 11 years, we're going in a different direction." Then he introduced his nephew, Tyler, as my replacement. Everyone looked at me. I smiled. "Congratulations," I said. My boss looked almost disappointed that I wasn't angry. He didn't know one thing. 3 weeks later, the company would call me begging for my signature. And that was when I finally understood how much power I had been carrying without realizing it. My name is Claire. I was 43 years old, and I had worked for Hartwell Commercial Services for 11 years. I wasn't the owner. I wasn't an executive. I wasn't even the loudest person in the office, but I knew that company better than anyone. I knew which clients needed quarterly compliance reports. I knew which licenses expired in October. I knew which government forms had to be submitted before certain contracts could legally renew. And most importantly, I knew where every critical document was stored. My boss, Richard, knew that too. That's why, for years, he would walk into my office and say, "Claire, I don't know what I'd do without you." I never thought much of it. I just did my job. Then, Richard's nephew, Tyler, graduated from college. And suddenly, everything changed. Tyler was 26. He was confident, charming, and completely inexperienced. Richard started bringing him into meetings. Then, Tyler began sitting in on client calls. Then, Richard started asking me to explain things to Tyler. One afternoon, Tyler leaned against my office door and said, "Honestly, Claire, you make this stuff look way more complicated than it is." I looked up from my computer. "That's because some of it is complicated." He laughed. "That's what people say when technology is passing them by." I smiled politely. Maybe I didn't argue. I didn't need to. The following Monday, Richard called an all-staff meeting. There were 12 of us sitting around the conference table. Richard stood at the front. Tyler was beside him. "I've made a decision about the future of the company," Richard said. I immediately knew. He wouldn't look at me. "Claire has done excellent work for us over the years." There was a pause. Then he said, "But we're moving toward a younger leadership structure." You could have heard a pin drop. He continued, "Tyler will be taking over Claire's responsibilities." Someone at the end of the table shifted uncomfortably. I looked at Tyler. He was smiling. Richard finally turned toward me. "Today will be your last day." I felt my face get warm, but I kept my voice steady. "Is this a termination?" Richard nodded. "Yes. Will I be receiving the decision in writing?" His expression changed slightly. "Yes, HR will handle it." I nodded. "Thank you." Richard looked surprised. "That's all?" I picked up my notebook. "What else would you like me to say?" Nobody spoke. Tyler gave a small laugh. I looked at him. "Congratulations, Tyler." His smile widened. "Thank you." I stood up. Then Richard said something I will never forget. "Before you leave, I need you to train Tyler." I turned around. "For how long?" "Until he understands everything." I looked at Tyler, then back at Richard. "You just terminated me." Richard sighed. "Claire, don't make this difficult." I smiled. I wasn't planning to. I packed my things. But before I left, I went back to my office. I opened my computer. I didn't delete anything. I didn't take anything that belonged to the company. Instead, I printed copies of documents I was legally entitled to retain, including my employment records, compensation history, and correspondence related to my responsibilities. Then I noticed something. A licensing agreement. My name was on it, not as an employee. As the authorized compliance officer, I stared at the document. Then I opened another file, another license, my signature, another contract, my authorization. I sat quietly for several minutes. Richard hadn't replaced my position. He had replaced the person responsible for maintaining several legally required authorizations, and he had no idea. I didn't call Richard. I didn't send him an angry email. Instead, I called an attorney. I explained everything. She listened carefully. Then she asked me one question. Did your employment agreement say those authorizations automatically transferred when you left? No. Did you sign anything transferring them? No. Did the company formally appoint someone else? Not that I know of. She paused. Then don't guess. Document everything. So I did. I organized every relevant document. Emails, licensing records, renewal notices, company policies, my original appointment letter. I created a timeline. Then I saved copies of everything I was legally allowed to retain. I didn't threaten anyone. I didn't post about Richard online. I didn't tell our clients what had happened. I simply waited. 3 days passed, then 5, then 9. On the 10th morning, my phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number. I answered. Hello? Is this Claire Morgan? Yes, this is Daniel from the state licensing office. My stomach tightened. How can I help you? We received a request from Hartwell Commercial Services to update the authorized compliance officer. I said nothing. Daniel continued. The request appears incomplete. I closed my eyes. What does it say? The company listed Tyler Hartwell as the replacement. I already knew. Then Daniel said, but your authorization is still active. My heart started beating faster. What happens now? We need documentation from the company before we can process the change. I thanked him and ended the call. 20 minutes later, I received another call. This time, it was Richard. I let it ring once, then answered. Hello, Richard. His voice was completely different from the man who had fired me. Claire, we have a small administrative issue. I looked out my window. What's the issue? We need you to sign something. I almost laughed, but I didn't. What exactly? There was silence. Then he said, it's just a transfer form. I leaned back in my chair. Richard, you terminated my employment. I know. You replaced me with Tyler. I know. So why would you need my signature? Another silence. Then he said, can we meet? I looked at the folder sitting beside me. Everything was inside, every document, every date, every signature. I took a breath. Of course. Richard sounded relieved. Tomorrow morning? No. He paused. Then when? I looked at the calendar. Next Monday. Claire, we really need this handled quickly. I understand. Can we please do Friday? I smiled. No. Then I hung up. I knew exactly where I wanted our next conversation to happen. Not in his office, not privately, and not with me sitting across from him as the employee he had discarded. Because on Monday morning, there would be a meeting. And this time, I wouldn't be the person being replaced. I would be the person everyone needed. Monday morning, I walked into Hartwell Commercial Services at 9:02 a.m. I was wearing a navy suit. I carried one folder. Richard was already in the conference room. So was Tyler. 2 senior managers were sitting beside them. Richard stood. Claire, Richard, he gestured toward the chair. Please sit. I did. Tyler looked uncomfortable. Richard opened a document. We simply need your signature confirming the transfer of the compliance authorization. I looked at the paper. Then I looked at him. I can't sign that. Richard's jaw tightened. Why not? Because I'm no longer employed by the company, and the transfer requires the company to demonstrate that the replacement meets the licensing requirements. Tyler spoke. I meet the requirements. I turned toward him. Do you? He didn't answer. I opened my folder. I brought the licensing requirements. I placed the first document on the table, then another, then another. The state requires 3 years of documented compliance experience for this authorization. Tyler's face changed. Richard looked at me. You knew about this? I knew because I was responsible for maintaining it. One of the managers picked up the document. Richard, she's right. The room went silent. Richard leaned back. So what are you saying? I'm saying you can't simply replace an authorized officer because you replaced an employee. Tyler looked at his uncle. What do we do? Richard didn't answer. I closed my folder. Then I said the sentence I'd been waiting to say. You need someone qualified to hold this authorization. Richard looked directly at me. Can you help us? I paused. Yes, his shoulders relaxed. But not as your employee. His expression froze. What do you mean? I mean, I'm not coming back to work for you. Richard stared at me. I continued. If you want me to provide transition services, I'll do it as an independent consultant. How much? I opened my folder again. $48,000 for a 6-month transition contract. Tyler almost choked. $48,000? I looked at him. You're free to decline. Richard raised his hand. Tyler, then he looked back at me. What exactly does $48,000 cover? Compliance transition, documentation, licensing coordination, training, and oversight during the transfer period. Richard was quiet. Then one of the senior managers said, We don't really have another option. Richard knew it. I knew it. Tyler knew it. The woman he had fired in front of 12 employees was now the only person in the room who could solve the problem. Richard finally nodded. Send me the agreement. I stood. I already did. He looked confused. I pointed toward the folder. Your attorney has had a copy since Friday. For the first time, Richard smiled. Not confidently. Nervously, you planned this. I shook my head. No, I looked him directly in the eyes. You planned this. Nobody spoke. I picked up my folder. Then I walked out. 6 months later, I was no longer working for Hartwell. I was running my own compliance consulting business. My first contract was with Richard's company. My second came from one of their former clients. Then another, then another. Within 6 months, I had earned more than $92,000 independently. I also learned that Tyler had eventually left the company. He wasn't fired. Richard simply realized that family connections couldn't replace experience. As for Richard, he called me twice, asking if I would consider returning. Both times, I politely declined. The second time, he said, You were always the backbone of this company. I smiled. I know. There was a long silence. Then he said, I wish I'd handled things differently. I do too. And that was all I said. I didn't need an apology to move forward. I didn't need him to admit he was wrong. The proof was already in my bank account. The proof was in my business. The proof was in the fact that I had walked out of that office with nothing but a box of personal belongings and built something that belonged entirely to me. I thought about that meeting sometimes. The conference room, the 12 people. Richard telling everyone I was being replaced. And then I remembered something important. Being underestimated isn't always a disadvantage. Sometimes it means people stop paying attention to what you're capable of. And when they finally realize your value, you don't have to beg them to see it. You simply decide whether you still want them in your life. I didn't. Moral never confuse someone's decision to undervalue you with your actual worth. Sometimes the most powerful comeback is building a life where their approval is no longer necessary. If you've ever been underestimated, comment below. And subscribe to Her Calm Comeback for more stories of quiet power.